The Western wasn't always about white hats, dusty saloons, and clean duels under the desert Sunday. In the 1,970 seconds, the genre exploded into something raw, rough, and unflinching. Studios pushed boundaries, critics recoiled, and censors went into panic mode. These weren't bedtime cowboy tales, these were firestorms of grit that rattled audiences to the core. Are you ready to step into the frontier they tried to hide from you? Let's peel back the curtain and ride straight into the chaos. Soldier Blue, 1970. When Soldier Blue hit theaters, audiences thought they were walking into just another Western. What they got was a wake-up call so jarring that some people reportedly staggered out of the theater. The film's climax, a massacre inspired by a real historical tragedy, wasn't dressed up in Hollywood gloss. It was shot with brutal detail that left little to the imagination. Viewers had never seen a Western refuse to blink like this before. Candice Bergen and Peter Strauss lead the story, but the real star is the unflinching lens on America's own violent past. It didn't matter how seasoned you were, this wasn't an easy ride. Critics debated whether it was making an important political point or just shocking for the sake of it. Either way, the response was explosive. American versions were trimmed down, while overseas markets often sliced entire reels. Britain nearly banned it outright. What made Soldier Blue unforgettable wasn't just its rough imagery. It was the way it used that imagery as protest. The violence was the message, shoving audiences into history's dark corners and refusing to let them look away. Even decades later, it's still hard to watch. But that's the point. Soldier Blue proved a Western could do more than entertain. It could haunt. And for censors, it was the nightmare they couldn't contain. A Town Called Bastard, Divided by Hell, 1971. Imagine a Western so chaotic and grim that distributors had to hack it apart just to get it shown in American theaters. That was A Town Called Bastard, later rebranded A Town Called Hell. Even the title gave censors headaches, but the real problem was on screen. Whippings, hangings, lynch mobs, and more filled the film until audiences felt overwhelmed. It wasn't just violent, it was relentless. Shot in Spain with a mix of British funding and American actors, the movie was meant to be a stylish revenge tale. Instead, it played like a fever dream of cruelty where no one was safe and no line went uncrossed. Critics called the plot messy, but nobody forgot the sheer barrage of punishment and bloodshed. The film's structure was stitched together with so many cuts and edits that it often felt like an entirely different movie depending on where you saw it. Censors in the United States trimmed it down for an R rating, but the brutality still came through. In some countries, screenings were delayed until officials figured out how much they could get away with showing. Ironically, the attempts to tame the film only made it stand out more. A Town Called Bastard didn't care about rules or reputation. It wanted to shock. And in doing so, it became a textbook example of how wild the Western could turn when left unchecked. Hannie Calder, 1971. Raquel Welch was known as a glamorous screen star, but Hannie Calder changed everything. In this Western, she takes on the role of a woman stripped of everything, rebuilt into a sharpshooter, and unleashed on the men who wronged her. The premise alone was enough to rattle censors, but it was the execution that pushed them over the edge. This wasn't a polished revenge fantasy. It was raw, desperate, and filled with intensity that clung to every frame. Welch's character trains under a gunfighter played by Robert Culp, and what follows is a road of vengeance paved with bullets and grit. The confrontations aren't quick or clean. They're uncomfortable, lingering, and aimed to make audiences feel every ounce of tension. Censors in both the United States and Britain insisted on trims, particularly in moments that lingered on suffering. Some states even attempted to pull it from drive-ins, claiming it was too disturbing for younger audiences. Yet Hannie Calder wasn't just violence for its own sake. It was a bold reimagining of what a Western could be, putting a woman at the center, not as a side character, but as the engine of the story. Welch's performance shocked critics, who expected glamour and got ferocity instead. Even cut down, the film still hit hard, proving that revenge tales in the 70 seconds were no longer safe or sanitized. The Hunting Party, 1971. Few westerns left cast and crew as uneasy as The Hunting Party. Gene Hackman and Candice Bergen headline this brutal story, but it was Oliver Reed's portrayal of a gang leader that stuck like a thorn in audiences' minds. The film centers on a wealthy rancher who sets out to recover his kidnapped wife, but instead of a noble rescue, viewers got a bleak, bloody parade of cruelty. The infamous centerpiece is a machine gun sequence that left no room for heroics. Only cold, mechanical slaughter. Audiences weren't prepared for that kind of imagery in a Western. Even hardened fans of the genre were shaken. Censors in both America and Britain jumped in, carving out entire chunks just to avoid an X rating. Yet what remained was still shocking enough to earn the film a reputation as one of the nastiest Westerns ever made. What makes The Hunting Party so unforgettable isn't just its body count. It's the sheer meanness of it all. There's no sentiment, no clean duel, no moral high ground, just humiliation, punishment, and slaughter. Even critics who admired its style admitted they were disturbed by the tone. For some, it was a warning about how far the Western had strayed. For others, it was proof that the genre could still shock people into talking. Either way, once you've seen The Hunting Party, you don't forget it. The Last Hard Men, 1976. Charlton Heston and James Coburn weren't strangers to tough roles, but The Last Hard Men dragged them into some of the grittiest territory the Western ever put on film. Heston plays a retired lawman, Coburn the vengeful outlaw who escapes prison and sets his sights on torment. From the opening frames, the film makes it clear this isn't a clean ride. It's a sun-baked nightmare where every fight feels like it leaves permanent scars. The set pieces are drawn out and unflinching. Fistfights turn ugly, gunfire echoes with grim weight, and one particular scene had audiences squirming so badly that censors jumped in with scissors. When the movie was later shown on television, entire sequences vanished, leaving a patchwork story that still managed to feel just as intense. What separates The Last Hard Men from other violent westerns is its complete disregard for likable heroes. Both leads are driven by bitterness and obsession. There's no one to root for, only a steady pressure that keeps tightening until the final clash. Critics at the time were divided, with some calling it excessive and others admiring its raw honesty. But for audiences, the memory of its harshness stuck. The Last Hard Men was proof that by the mid-70 seconds, the genre had shed its old myths. It wasn't about law and order anymore. It was about survival, obsession, and the damage people leave behind. That alone made it a nightmare for censors, and a legend for fans who wanted their westerns as real as possible. Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, 1974. Sam Peckinpah was never known for playing nice, but Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia might be his wildest fever dream. This isn't a western in the classic sense, it's more of a modern, dusty nightmare. But its DNA is all frontier grit. Warren Oates stars as Benny, a washed-up piano player who takes a bounty job that spirals into madness. The prize? Proof of death, carried around in a burlap sack. Peckinpah drenches the film in sweat, dust, and sheer desperation. Gunfire shreds through bodies, cars crash in clouds of dirt, and the violence never feels glamorous. Instead, it's personal, grotesque, and strangely hypnotic. Heads literally roll, and with each mile Benny drives, the line between sanity and vengeance blurs until nothing makes sense anymore. Censors didn't know what to do with it. America wanted cuts. Foreign markets tried bans. Some audiences sat frozen in silence, while others stormed out in disgust. For years, it was dismissed as madness. But over time, Alfredo Garcia found its cult following. Fans now talk about it in whispers, like a forbidden legend you only share with those who can handle it. Peckinpah's vision was ugly and relentless, but that was the point. He wanted to show a world where violence is the only language anyone understands. Watching it isn't easy. Forget entertainment. This one's an endurance test. But for those who stick with it, Alfredo Garcia is the kind of film you never forget, no matter how hard you try. The Revengers, 1972. William Holden was already a Hollywood legend, but The Revengers took his screen persona into the dirt and left it there. He plays John Benedict, a rancher who loses everything in one bloody afternoon when a gang wipes out his entire family. What follows is a revenge quest so relentless that even the censors flinched. Instead of gathering noble allies, Benedict recruits a ragtag crew of convicts, outcasts, and killers. Together, they march into a storm of ambushes, knife fights, and gun battles that feel more like punishments than entertainment. The violence here isn't stylized, it's sweaty, desperate, and cruel. Every bullet lands heavy, every wound lingers. Audiences could practically feel the weight of it in their seats. Censors reacted fast. American theaters trimmed scenes, while the British Board of Film Classification hacked away at entire stretches. Yet even stripped down, the brutality bled through. Critics noted how unrelenting the film felt, calling it suffocating at times. What makes The Revengers stand out is its honesty. There's no noble outlaw or shining sheriff here. Benedict is broken, haunted, and just as dangerous as the men he hunts. By the end, you're left wondering whether revenge gave him justice or simply turned him into another outlaw, with nothing left to lose. That bitter ambiguity is exactly what made censors nervous. Lawman, 1971. Burt Lancaster was a powerhouse actor, and in Lawman he gave audiences one of the coldest lawmen the genre had ever seen. He plays Jared Maddox, a marshal on a mission to bring in a group of ranch hands after an accidental killing. But don't expect the clean lines of right versus wrong. Maddox isn't a hero. He's an enforcer with tunnel vision, and that makes him just as dangerous as the men he's chasing. The violence here isn't flashy. It's sudden, blunt, and merciless. Shootouts erupt without warning, leaving bodies sprawled in the dirt. One shotgun blast into a crowd rattled audiences so badly that TV networks scrambled to trim it down. Critics debated whether Maddox was upholding justice or abusing it, but nobody denied the unsettling chill that ran through the film. Censors weren't pleased. Too much blood for family audiences, too much grit for comfort. When Lawman hit smaller markets, it was often trimmed to soften its edges. Yet even in cut form, the film's intensity remained. What makes Lawman a standout is its refusal to hand audiences an easy answer. Lancaster plays Maddox with such relentless conviction that you're forced to question whether the badge makes him righteous or just another figure of fear. For a genre built on heroes and villains, that kind of gray morality was groundbreaking. And for censors, it was a problem they couldn't neatly fix. The Deadly Trackers, 1973. Richard Harris wasn't afraid of dark roles, but The Deadly Trackers plunged him into some of the bleakest territory of his career. He plays a small-town sheriff whose entire life is ripped apart in a single act of brutality. From that moment on, Harris's character is consumed by vengeance, pursuing a gang led by Rod Taylor with an obsession that borders on madness. What makes the film stand out is its tone. The violence is both personal and public, spilling into crowded streets and leaving audiences unsettled. Harris doesn't chase justice so much as he dives headfirst into revenge, and it shows in every frame. Shootouts drag on uncomfortably. Fistfights end in bloody exhaustion. Even moments of silence feel dangerous, as if someone is about to break. Censors in both the United States and Britain stepped in, slashing television versions into a patchwork of scenes. Entire sequences of suffering were removed, but the rawness still bled through. Critics at the time described it as feverish, unsettling, and a step too far for traditional Western fans. What really rattled audiences, though, was the message. By the end, you're not sure if Harris's sheriff is any better than the men he's hunting. The Deadly Trackers doesn't let you off the hook with easy answers. It shows what vengeance can do to the soul, and leaves you with a chill that lingers long after the credits roll. Doc, 1971. Forget the heroic Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday you thought you knew. Doc stripped the mythology down to the bone and gave audiences something far messier. Stacy Keach plays Doc Holliday as a bitter, coughing gambler with one foot already in the grave, while Harris Yulin's Wyatt Earp is less a noble sheriff and more a conflicted survivor. The gunfight at the O.K. Corral, usually a moment of Western glory, is presented here as a grim, clumsy disaster. Men fall not with slow-motion grandeur but with sudden, awkward violence. The aftermath is worse, leaving survivors bitter and broken. It's a far cry from the dime novel versions, or even earlier Hollywood retellings. Censors reacted fast, especially overseas, where the stark gunfight was considered too unpolished, too ugly. Scenes were cut not for excess gore, but for sheer refusal to romanticize. Viewers who expected another legend were instead forced to watch a myth unravel. What makes Doc unforgettable is its insistence on reality. There's no clean heroism, no shining legacy. Just drifters making desperate choices in a world that offers no comfort. It wasn't what people wanted, but it was exactly what made it groundbreaking. For many, Doc was the first time the West stopped being a fantasy and became a nightmare of dust, sickness, and wasted dreams. McCabe and Mrs. Miller, 1971. Robert Altman wasn't known for making easy films, and McCabe and Mrs. Miller proved it. At first glance, it looks like a slow-burn western about a gambler, Warren Beatty, and a businesswoman, Julie Christie, trying to build a town. But beneath the snow-covered landscapes is one of the bleakest and most realistic finales the genre had ever seen. The final act is where the violence hits. No stylized duels or triumphant music, just a snowbound showdown that feels like a documentary. McCabe stumbles through alleys, exchanges gunfire on rooftops, and falls in the freezing cold while the town goes on around him. There's no glory, only muffled silence and bitter reality. Censors didn't ban it outright, but TV networks hacked away at the broadcast version. Some claimed the edits ruined the story, while others argued it was still too heavy even with cuts. Either way, the unrelenting realism unsettled audiences who expected something more theatrical. What makes McCabe and Mrs. Miller powerful is its refusal to entertain illusions. Altman took the genre and stripped it bare, leaving behind only survival and loss. It's not the most violent film on this list in sheer numbers, but the way it uses violence, sudden, messy, and inevitable, made it feel more real than any shootout could. No wonder it rattled censors and audiences alike. The Hired Hand, 1971. Peter Fonda stepped behind the camera for The Hired Hand, a film that looked small on paper but cut deeper than most big-budget westerns of the era. Fonda also stars as Harry, a drifter who returns home after years on the trail, hoping to rebuild his life. But instead of comfort, he finds regret, violence, and the weight of choices that can't be undone. The violence here isn't flashy, it's rare, but when it erupts, it feels like a thunderclap. Gunshots don't fade away, they echo, leaving bodies broken and audiences unsettled. Fonda avoids stylized heroics, focusing instead on how pain lingers. Scenes of suffering were trimmed in some international markets, and American TV versions softened the blows. But the underlying rawness never disappeared. Critics didn't know what to do with it. Some praised its honesty, while others found it unbearably slow and grim. But for those who connected, The Hired Hand felt like the most honest Western of the decade. It wasn't about legends or myths. It was about ordinary people making choices that spiral into tragedy. By the end, you're left with a story that doesn't let you escape. Every moment of violence echoes long after, and every decision feels permanent. The Hired Hand proved that sometimes the most dangerous frontier isn't the open range, it's the heart. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, 1973. Sam Peckinpah's name shows up again, and for good reason. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid was a troubled production from the start, but what audiences finally saw was a revisionist Western dripping with grit. James Coburn plays Garrett, the weary lawman, while Chris Christopherson embodies the reckless Billy. Their cat-and-mouse story was already iconic, but Peckinpah turned it into something far darker. Violence in this film isn't just frequent, it's inevitable. Shootouts unfold with a grim inevitability, each one stripping away another layer of myth. The famous deaths aren't romanticized, they're cold and empty. Even the soundtrack, featuring Bob Dylan, adds to the mournful tone rather than offering relief. Censors weren't the main problem here. It was the studio. United Artists slashed Peckinpah's original cut, removing entire sequences to soften the tone. The result was a choppy release that disappointed fans and critics alike. But when Peckinpah's fuller version surfaced years later, audiences finally saw just how unflinching his vision had been. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid isn't just about an outlaw and a lawman. It's about the death of the West itself, dragging its myths into the grave one gunshot at a time. No wonder it left censors, executives, and audiences shaken. This was a funeral for the frontier, and Peckinpah made sure you felt every moment. And there you have it, 15 westerns too rough for the 1,970 seconds to handle. These films weren't about romantic cowboys or dusty legends. They were about survival, obsession, and the brutal truth behind the myths. Some were censored, others hacked apart, but all of them proved one thing. The West wasn't golden, it was jagged and merciless. Which of these films do you think pushed the limits the hardest? Drop your answer in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Because the frontier's dark side still has stories left to tell.